I'll never forget the day I read a book. It was contagious, 70 pages. There were pictures here and there, so it wasn't hard to bear. The day I read a book.
Okay, so welcome to the Wafer-Thin Books Club. This month we are reading what I will unabashedly say is my absolute favorite book of all my life so far. I first read this book in probably I want to say around 76 or so. It wasn't that long after it came out. This was the original paperback edition I found. And I have to say, I read this so fast. I was in a period when I was reading, just blasting through books. And I remembered I liked it, but it was actually my brother who came later, having grabbed my copy and started reading a couple of passages saying, this is such wonderful writing. And I thought, wait, I didn't catch on to that. But since then, whenever I find a copy, at least in the US, I pick a copy up. And so over the course of time, I do have several actually first editions, which I have to say, this is a terrible cover for this book. It doesn't convey, I mean, I'm not sure what is the right cover, but this isn't it. And I see the artist is uncredited in the cover.
I'm gonna go pick up my cover and see if you have one of those.
Yeah,
This one here.
Love that one.
Nice.
Yeah. I regret I had a couple of those and I've given them all away, and I should have held on to one.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of not appropriate either, but it's more fun for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. My daughter loved it. She was like, "Oh, what's this about?" So, yeah.
Yeah, I picked up a couple in trips to London or in the early part of this century, and then yeah, okay, yeah, that's that one kind of gives you the heavenly sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of like the one you showed us, but it has little tiny little what looks like buildings, but it's sort of impressionistic. So I think it's a pretty good cover.
Well, it beats. This is the one that Faber. I think you've got probably a Faber edition, maybe. It was a British edition, and this is what they started with when they reissued a bunch of Frayn's work maybe 20 years ago. And this is terrible too. It's just a time clock where sweet drips down and becomes dreams. I'm not sure what that's supposed to convey. Valancourt's at least shows a mountain, so you get that theme enters in there. So it's a tough novel to convey in a cover, I think, because I think it's a novel you have to start reading it to understand kind of its special character. But before we get started with talking about Sweet Dreams, let's, as usual, see what the folks have been reading. James, starting off with you, what's been good this month?
Yeah, well, the short stuff I read this month, a couple of them I don't have to show because I read them electronically or from the library. I read a fantastic novel called L'air du Temps, 1985, by Diane.
Give me
Greco.
that title again, sorry.
L'air du Temps. It's L'air du Temps in 1995 in brackets. It's I'll post it in the chat.
Okay.
By Diane Greco Josefowicz, I think is her name pronunciation. But yeah, it's just about a girl growing up in the in the 80s, mainly 1985 it's set, and just her dad's sort of involved in some shifty insurance fraud possibly, and her mum is dissatisfied, and it's just I mean a kind of classic coming of age book. When it's just 100 pages, beautifully written, absolutely as close to perfect I think as a little book can get. And I think it's meant to be the first of three, which are going to be this character at different stages of her life, but this is the only one that's come out so far. But I love that. And the other one, which I don't have to hand, is A Dark Corner by Celia Dale, just a really good, really nasty little crime novel. And the two I do have here, Horror, which is just three, I guess, ghost stories, horror stories by Edith, Olivier, who she wrote a book called The Love Child, which is also a great.
Oh yeah,
novel.
yeah.
Yeah, and these are just basically she seems to have written a lot of short stories, but terribly named Snuggly Books just found the horror stories that she wrote and put them out together. It's only about 90 pages, 3 stories, but yeah, they're really good. And When the Wave Collapses by Norah Woodley or Woodsey. I think this is actually self-published, but it's just again a really good little science fiction novella about people trying to get teleportation to work, and they succeed, but only by shunting things from their universe to a different universe and back and forth. So people elsewhere in a different timeline are suddenly finding weird stuff dropping out of the sky and causing mayhem. But yeah, really, really nicely written. So I'll bung these in the chat now.
Is it a comic in tone or?
More serious. It's more the kind of chaos caused by what they're doing and the problems that it creates. But yeah, just really nicely written, as I say.
Okay. Well, I actually a couple of things. I've kind of got projects in midway, but one I reread because we're actually going to be publishing it next year. So we're going through the text and conveying it as Christopher Burney's Solitary Confinement, which Christopher Burney was an SOE agent, parachuted into France into a network that had just gotten blown, and he got arrested like right away, and they put him into solitary confinement in the big German, well, French German prison in Paris called Fresnes, and kind of forgot about him. So he was in solitary confinement for something like around 560 days with nothing to do and nothing to read and no one to talk to, and eventually they do the tapping on the walls thing that was from Count of Monte Cristo, and you see in other prison novels, but it becomes a very spiritual novel. It's essentially or a book, because it's essentially how he came to preserve his sanity and his soul in this vacuum that he was stuck in for such a vast amount of time.
Is it a memoir or is it a fictionalized?
It's a memoir. I shouldn't have called it a novel. Yeah, it's a memoir. And from there, he was shipped to Buchenwald. He wrote another book about Buchenwald called The Dungeon Democracy, which I don't think has aged. It's sort of less timeless. And he kind of bore psychological scars from that experience for much of the rest of the life. He kept coming back to revisit it. So we're publishing a short piece that he wrote, about 25 years after Solitary Confinement, which came out in the early 50s. He wrote another one called Descent from Ararat, which is a little bit more symbolic, but it's kind of about fighting with his own demons from the experience, essentially post-traumatic stress that he was still coping with. The other one was just pure fun, was How to Start Writing and When to Stop, Advice for Writers, which is a collection of pieces. Wislawa Szymborska, the Polish poet, wrote a column, kind of a help a Dear Abby, if you will, column for writers in a Polish literary journal for years. And what this is only her answers. So you have to imagine what the requests were. In some ways, you can it's not hard to figure out what the kind of request that they got was, but it's a fun little book, and it's like just the right length. That's 96 pages. Any longer than this would be torturous, I think, but it's just enough to give you a good taste of it. And the other one that I got onto, we're publishing a book in November that's set in Vienna, but it's set in Vienna during the Habsburg Empire era. But the woman I'm working with,
I'm sold. I want it.
It's amazing. It's about we're publishing it as Red House Alley. The German title is De Heilige Scarabaeus, which is the Holy Scarab. I just thought that didn't work. People would say, is it about Egypt? It's about a house of prostitution, and specifically about a mother who gets raped by her rich landowner, goes to Vienna, becomes a prostitute, essentially becomes an alcoholic and dies. And then her daughter, who falls into the same system but manages to escape. And anyway, the translator, Stephanie Ortega, actually, as a young child, was in post-war Vienna in like Third Man era. And so that got me into reading some post-war Vienna novels. So this one, Return from to Vienna, is a journal by an Austrian writer named Hilda Spiel. I'd read about and written about one of her novels earlier on. She went back. She was living in. She was a Jewish woman, escaped to England and then returned as a correspondent. And then also Robert Neumann's Children of Vienna, which is about a group of kids essentially surviving in the basement of a house, living by their wits, which he wrote. He also emigrated to England. He wrote it in English and then translated it after visiting Vienna and seeing essentially how abject the poverty and how terrible the situation was. Particularly Vienna, like Berlin, was a divided city, divided between the Soviets and the Allies. So those were both really illuminating reads. So yeah, let's see. Some folks are mentioning some others in the chat, and I always have to find the chat and with this new expanded menu. So Audrey, tell us a little bit about the servants' quarters.
Servants' quarters, I don't know when or how it got onto my to be read list, but it's from 2009. And I really don't know the cultural background of the author Janet Fried, but she sets it in South Africa in post-World War II period of a young Jewish girl whose dad was almost fatally injured on a golf course. And so he lays in the room next door, barely there. And she goes in to talk to him when she feels frustrated. And her mom's like ready to move on, which she eventually does. And she winds up going up to the hill to Mr. Harding, who was disfigured by burns and things during the war. And he has her sit with and try to rehabilitate his seemingly on the spectrum nephew. So there's all kinds of things and the growing pains of coming to age. So I just got to the point.
Sounds interesting.
I just got to the point where
they US or
was it public? I think it was published in the US. I want to say I don't have my hands on it right now. I think it's upstairs with me, but it's very good. I recommend it.
Okay. And I see, is it Mariah mentions James, of course, which is hot out right now, by Percival Everett. Saint Sebastian's Abyss, which I read a couple of months ago and raved about. A fantastic novel, and I love the way Haber uses repetition in that novel in such a creative way. It's something that you think, oh my gosh, this isn't going to work, and yet it just, I think it's a remarkable piece of work. And then one I'm not familiar with, Mind's Eye by Hakan Nesser. And then she mentions parallel stories, which is definitely not a Wafer-Thin book.
Yeah, that's the opposite of Wafer-Thin. It's wafer thick. It was fantastic, though. I feel like I could have kept on reading it forever. I mean, in a way, it just kind of stopped, because I was just like, oh, I just want more and more and more. It was a wonderful world to live in. Just amazing, amazing book. And I'm loving Saint Sebastian's Abyss. I'm writing that right now, and it really reminds me. It's got kind of a Thomas Bernhardt kind of feel to it, that the novel of his, The Loser. It reminds me of The Loser in certain ways, just this kind of fraught relationship between these two guys, and then the repetition and the kind of, it's almost like picking away at a sore or something. You know, it's very, it's great. I love it a lot. It seems like there's quite a few people that I read these days that remind me of Bernhard, and that's always a good thing. And the Mind's Eye, that's a detective novel. It's what,
Oh, okay.
Scandinavian, and it was very, very good, very good. Yeah.
Anyone else want to offer up something good they've read this month before we jump into Sweet Dreams? So if not, first of all, thank you all for reading Sweet Dreams. I hope you have, because it is, yeah, I think it's, even though it's in print, at least, I don't know, how hard was it to get a copy there, James? Did you have to get a used copy? Yeah, you're on mute. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a copy from before. I had a big Frayn binge about 20 years ago. So yeah, I already had a copy. But I did actually look around to see, and yes, it's in print from Valancourt, the US, but very expensive here. I think in theory Faber has it in print, but in fact you can't get hold of it. So
yeah, that's a shame. I almost didn't put it on the list because I thought it would kind of be tough to get in Australia, but I mean, and I salute Valancourt because between this Valentine paperback, which my copy is dated 1975, and I probably bought it within months of that. And this Sweet Frayn's Dreams has been out of print in the US and even in the UK. I think this, which came out, I want to say around 2001 or so, 2003. Yeah, between the late 70s and 2003 was out of print in the UK as well, after this little spate of Penguin reissues.
I have to say Valancourt have an odd publishing focus, but I think it's great. They seem to publish old Gothic novels, gay novels, weird horror stuff, and mid 20th century British stuff, and they're all great. And it's not the normal kind of publishing approach most publishers have. And yeah, I'm surprised they make a go of it, but I'm glad they do.
They're doing an amazing job. I mean, not only do they have a remarkable, I mean, I think they make their big bucks on the horror series that they've brought out, because that's got a kind of automatic readership. But James and his husband, who run the press, are also very committed to kind of bringing back lost gay literature. So they've brought back a lot of kind of the more obscure, like Rodney Garland. They've done his, and Robin Malm, and a variety of others. And then, yeah, they just, I think some of it is stuff that, because I've been in contact with those guys for years now, I think some of them, they just, like Sweet Dreams, I suspect they came across from my writing about it. And, but I mean, it's a book that I think you either love it instantly, or it leaves you cold or something. But, and so, yeah, I hope we made past a few sales their way, because they have admitted that this, and they also, like, they've reissued a couple of John Wayne's book. That's John Wayne, Wain, not the cowboy star, the English novelist and poet. I mean, John Wayne is kind of like a classic example of a totally worthy writer who just doesn't have anything, there's nothing. His life was a normal life. He had no controversies. He had no scandals that I know of. He just tried to be a good writer and write interesting things. And then he died. And I mean, I think Valancourt has more John Wayne in print in the US than I'd be amazed that there's much of John Wayne in print in the UK. but it's sort of niche. Well, he's not Kingsley Amis, so why bother or something? But yeah, Valancourt has a I really admire what they're doing, and they do it. And the other interesting thing, all small publishers in the US owe a huge credit to Valancourt, because they, under US copyright law for years, there was a requirement that you sent a physical copy of your book to the Library of Congress, or technically your copyright was not officially registered. And Valancourt said, look, this is BS these days. We can send you a PDF, we can send you an EPUB. We are not sending you a physical copy of every book. And I think it was like more than one copy. Anyway, and so they fought that legally and they won. So that now if you're a small publisher, you just essentially have to send a digital transmission to the Library of Congress, and your copyright is, so to speak, official. It's sort of like it seems like a niggling cost, but for a small publisher, every copy counts, and having to mail them in, particularly it was a somewhat cumbersome registration process. So that was a legal battle. I think they won last year, and took a long time, but it was, they big kudos to Valancourt for that. So Sweet Dreams, reactions to that. I'm going to keep my mouth shut because I'm just interested in hear what other folks think about the book.
Audrey's doing a thumbs up. I really liked it. It was interesting actually to hear what you said. When you were talking last month about how much you loved it, how it was your favorite book, I was like, oh dear. So as I say, I went through a massive Michael Frayn thing where I think I read all his novels, his plays, his collected columns about 20 odd years ago. And this is one of the ones I remembered least at the time. And rereading it now, I suspect that's because I loved it now. And I wonder if it's because it's a book that when you're 20 odd years old is just less likely to hit. I don't know. Because
I think that's very true.
Yeah, the kind of later life regrets and dreams. Because it really did strike me really strongly this time around, which has the unfortunate effect of making me wonder about all the other books I read at the time that I didn't appreciate, and what else have I let get away? I don't know. But putting those neuroses aside, it really was just on a sentence level beautifully written, and the 70s, in some ways, the 70s-ness of it made it seem, I think, richer reading it now than it might have been in the 70s for some reason. It just gave that extra level of kind of warped idealism in the way that the people in it live. But I also think it's quite an alarmingly sad book, because certainly to me, I mean, I'm assuming all the other people in his heaven aren't real. They're not the people he knew in his life, because his real life wife and children aren't there. They're not there. His real life friends, I mean, at one point he's talking to someone who basically says, this isn't my heaven, this is your heaven. So it's as though all these people he's surrounded with in his happiness, they're all, they're all simulations, if you like, of the people he knew in life. So he's actually he's enjoying himself thoroughly, but it's this horrible, empty world that he's actually in. So it's got this kind of creeping, I don't know, existential nastiness at the edges, which I found discomforting, but yeah, definitely added to the kick of it. But no, I loved it.
And as sweet a guy as he was, he also came up with the plans of letting the tigers loose to pick some people off, and setting up mangrove swamps for the alligators to pick some people off. I mean, Londoners, they don't know how vicious alligators are. You want to run, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I think the construction, I mean, it's I think one of the things I like about, I mean, number one, I think there are so many fascinating in a way, it's sort of like what Mark Haber does with Saint Sebastian's Abyss, in that there are like verbal constructs that Frayn does. I mean, there are things that repeat. So like every time they eat the same things. It's always gigot ergo and taramasalata and apple crumb.
That haricot thingy and yeah.
Yeah, right. And so there are, I mean, it's definitely heaven drawn from his memories and his experiences and his sort of prejudices, so that in some way there's nothing new, right? Nothing new really happens. He's in heaven and people are still nuts about trying to get on television so they can offer their opinions about things. And people become known because they're pontificating on television. But then there's just, I mean, like, you can fly. Okay, yeah, you can fly, but after a while, you kind of becomes passe.
And then if you do it when you really need to, it's just embarrassing. It's a social faux pas.
Right, yeah. And then the working model, giving his kids a working model of their life. And then the kids reading the book that, and their neighbor or their friend appears, their friend who can't remember anybody's name. So it's, here's Mr. Leyland. He comes up and he says, "Hello, Mr.
Yeah.
So it's just like, it's like, in some ways for me, this book, one of the reasons I love it is sort of like Woodhouseian in the sense that things are going to, after you've read it, a couple of times, when things are going to happen. And yet they're done so splendidly, neatly. I mean, Frayn, I don't think he's ever written prose as sort of like perfect as this book is, just full of sentences that are just so well shaped in terms of timing and the rhythm of them and the logic of them, and things like things can't be better because every day they are. And I like that idea of a heaven like that, that's a manageable heaven. It's not a boring heaven, right?
And when it gets boring, you just loop back and start all over again.
Yeah, exactly.
And he doesn't have that many like bon mots or aphorisms, but he'll throw something in that when you think about it is a zinger, like where they're at the dinner party. He stands up and taps on the table for silence, intending to announce this new discovery in the hope that it will cause yet more laughter and increase his reputation for honesty still further, that he had made up the story about the tutor on his knees. Because I was following around and then I realized he had made up. Everyone fell silent and looked at him, and why don't we have coffee next door? For he has realized something else in the moment of inspiration between standing up and beginning to speak, that the aesthetic effect of honesty depends upon restraint in its application. I'm like, woo!
Isn't that a wonderful? Yeah, I mean it
builds to that so beautifully.
Exactly. There are lines like that throughout this book where you just have to say, I just want to take it out and place it someplace as this so well constructed. It's not only a neat thought, but it's so neatly put, I guess.
Well, like the wonderful scene where he meets, this guy they all admired at uni who's a couple of years above them, and this sort of man is quite, diffidently has to admit that actually he's God, and it's sort of socially embarrassing to be. It's just so beautifully put together.
Yeah, so I guess it's just, this novel to me, it's like the little working model of their life in the book, which is I can always go back to it, and there'll be the Chases and the Whalens, and they'll all sit around and they'll have gigot haricot, and they're he's gonna have his Howard Baker things, like when his friend invents man, and of course it's Howard. and he's on stage and they're all waiting it, and then he just kind of wanders off into this long, aimless story. And you realize, okay, well, this is, man is in Howard's image.
Well, and Phil's version of Howard, because Phil
Yeah.
is not
Yeah.
that fond of him.
No.
So that's how Phil saw him, as a collection of little tics and mannerisms, and as a little man who would never get by. But here at the end, or almost the end, because at the end he's where he is in the beginning, getting ready to have his fatal car crash. But just before that, he appears to be Prime Minister of England.
Right, right. Well, and also I think one of the things I think Frayn does so well is he has the latitude to go a lot of different places. So when he's talking about Howard meets Phil in heaven, and they kind of wander around the city together, at a number of points they change age kind of seamlessly. They start down the street in their mid-30s, and then they're 21 years old and naive and full of enthusiasm, all that. And the way you can shift back and forth and kind of have that fluidity in life is, that's sort of like an attitude about the possibility of heaven, which in effect has no bounds, and taking advantage of that, weaving it in. I just think this book has so many just sublime little ideas that just pop in the course of, and yet it's got a very conventional narrative shape in some ways, right? It is a growing older and growing mature and growing, moderating one's expectations. It's a career model story, and abandoning the establishment and going off and living in the countryside and then getting pulled back into it. These are all patterns we've seen before in fiction, and yet, not in this kind of outside all the world context. So I every time I read this book, I come across stuff that I just think, I don't know how you did that, but it makes such perfect sense.
Well, the way it slips around in time is really impressive, because the way he can do one thing, and then he can go out and he can meet Rose, and he meets Rose before he meets his wife, but it's not, he hasn't traveled in time per se. He just, today he's going to be meeting Rose before he meets his wife. And, they're all spending all their time working on things that already exist because they've slipped outside of time. But it handles it all very matter-of-factly and very cleverly and not confusingly, in a way that is actually really quite peculiar for a conventionally written novel. I mean, it's not attempting to be avant-garde in any way, but it does some really quite impressive things, with time, outside of the kind of adjusting their age for whatever they want to be. But just the way, the internal time of the narrative shifts, drops back and loops and jumps ahead. It's quite amazing.
And the essential kindness and goodness of Howard, who never becomes cynical. He keeps adjusting. Sometimes he's naive. He's not always forward thinking, but he is really trying to do the best thing that he can at that time. And he sees where accommodations have to be made, where other people really must be more cynical, or appear to be, or they're just playing their little roles and don't change very much. He changes his attitude when he needs to, but his core is still trying to do the best he can, which I think is important to have amid the cynicism and the satire that we see.
Yeah, you're right. It's an oddly uncruel book for all its cynicism. Partly that's because Howard's illusions about himself are only ever punctured in a way that makes him feel better about himself. But it's not savage in the way you might expect it to be.
No, I think that's one of the reasons I find it a book I can go back to again, because if it was savagely satirical, it would kind of not there's a certain joyfulness in this. There's all these little moments of delight, and just, he's flying to England. And of course, he's flying, in the description, London is much grayer and all of that. And you can see, I mean, I was never in London in the 70s, but I can imagine it's a fairly accurate description of returning it. But I'm going to England because, well, of course, I speak the language. And he's going around and interviewing, and just, you have to think, well, okay, he's not really back on Earth, really, is he? But
I
it's so
found it.
Earth-like.
Yeah, I found it odd because in some cases he must be interacting with living people of that time, and then other people seem to float in who clearly are from the versions of heaven or beyond, and then different time periods. And like that director of the one thing, he said, go back to New Canaan, Connecticut, whatever,
Right.
to April 14th, and it was called that. And he's like, book him to send him back. It's like, oh, okay, so it's not that they can get like a DVD of it. No, you're going to send Howard back in time to New
Yeah, he's
Canaan
gonna go
during
walk
that
around the
period
streets.
and watch the film that they created of people being kind to one another.
Right. So they're making all these little model worlds and trying them
Yeah.
out, so to speak. And yet it's all planet Earth, of course. They don't reinvent. I mean, it's I mean, that's the fact that at the same time you have, the sort of limitless possibilities of heaven suggested in so many different ways, and yet it's always going to be Earth, and it's not just Earth, it's going to be London, England, and the suburbs of London, and in that time period, and that Oxbridge culture, and the BBC, and all those other trappings of a very, very specific time and a very specific culture that's not at all universal. Yeah, anyway, I still don't know how to communicate why I love this novel, but I think it's just because it's got so many delightful little bits, and he takes us to heaven, and he really gives us a chance to essentially walk around a model of our own life, so to speak. Including folding up the model of the life and throwing it in the trash bin when we go out to the country. So it's disposable too.
Well, that's it. And that you see that in how, so the slightly sad way, how little, for example, his children figure in his own life and afterlife. They're at best very minor characters. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again,
Felicity's in
very
charge of
much,
them.
yeah, it could be very much of the culture of the time he was in.
Well, yes.
Because I do find his portrayal of the women kind of shallow, and that the women are not that developed, and they're either wives, girlfriends, or they're mentioned men and women, and but they don't really have leading roles. I mean, Felicity really had the most depth. Rose was pretty much a cipher, and then God's wife, she had a couple good lines too. So
right.
But again, it makes sense because Howard's heaven, and I think this is the depth to which he's ever thought about women.
Exactly. Yeah.
they have those roles in his life. So
Exactly. Yeah.
And it may also be related. I think this is around the time. So Frayn is still married now to the biographer Clare Tomalin, but it's his second marriage, and this could have been around the time that the first marriage. I know he has at least a daughter from his first marriage, and so that I think that's very much to the point that James made, which is this is the world as it's envisioned, and the limits of how it can be envisioned from Howard's mind. He is still totally, he's attracted to and mystified by women. but in a very superficial way, right? So
That's it. They only have as much depth in his heaven as they need to be interesting to him as characters, but not really as people.
right, and children even less significant
Yeah.
of a and you know, this parent father comes and goes in the course of a phone call. But I love that phone call because it, you know, it is the sort of thing you know, I don't know if you've had unfulfilled relations with your parents, you always, at least I always wanted to have, you know, a soulful conversation. And yet when I had those opportunities, you end up talking about the most trivial things and the
We'll pop
opportunity.
around sometime. We'll give us warning so we can put the cuppa on and the kettle on and that's something. Yeah.
So many people's dads said, well, that was nice to talk to you. Let me put your mother on. And then you talk twice or three times as long to your mom because she's able to go off on interesting stories and your dad doesn't do that.
Yeah, that's the truth. Well, but see, Howard is so delighted. You know, he feels like I'm finally having that conversation with my dad that I've always wanted, and yet there's nothing different. It is just as superficial and pointless and you know, not getting to the core of anything, and yet he's so proud of it. He feels so.
Well, I think that's it again. It's the limits of what he can envisage. So he can't actually imagine that good conversation with his father. So he just has the regular one.
Yeah, what would I say? I can't. I'm not that creative. If I could have come up with that conversation, I would have had it in real life, right? But I can't, so I'm going to imagine it. And yet I'm going to have that delight, you know, that sense of warm satisfaction. And I think that's kind of the reasons I love reading this book. Kind of, it's a comfort read now for me. Is you know, in some ways, this is life. It's no better than the life he had on Earth. In so many ways, it's no different. It's because it's all coming out of his head, and yet so often he feels so good about it. And so, you know, I just think there are many times when I think about this book in the course of a day and think, well, there's no reason I can't say this is good. You know, I'm sitting in traffic. An hour ago, I was sitting in traffic to go pick up our community supported agriculture haul for the week. And it's traffic and it's hot and it's not going any faster than I needed. And yet, you know, I'm going to pick up vegetables from some nice people, and why isn't that okay? That's a perfect.
You just need a sort of chorus of friendly people going, "That's classic Brad," or "It's such a Brad story," and then you'd be fine.
And make sure you get the either green beans or white beans to have with your roast lamb.
Yeah, with your roast lamb, absolutely. I mean, those are sorts of things. I suspect, again, that's an example. This was when, you know, Elizabeth David had written all her books about French cooking and Spanish cooking and Italian cooking. And they were, you know, food was finally getting to be not total crap in England. They were starting to learn how to cook a little French food. So that's where we get Terra Salata and Gigot Erico, because they were all cooking out of Elizabeth David cookbooks. Very 70s, I think, from what I know of England anyway. Well, okay. Any other inputs that folks want to offer about I hope you enjoyed the book, because I think it is a special kind of, for me, it's a very special kind of book, just because I think he pulls off some magic tricks that are not, you know, and so effortlessly and so elegantly that you don't even, I mean, that's why I said the first time I read this, I missed half of the wonderful stuff that was going on there.
Yeah, same.
Well, okay, next month we have a classic, Willa Cather's A Lost Lady, which is a significant novel, not just in American literature, but also in Cather's career. And I will probably include some lines from around the time she wrote this book. She wrote an essay called the novel Démeublé, which means essentially unfurnished novel, where she decided to kind of abandon. She felt like there was too much clutter and too much description in novels, and she wanted to pare that back, which was sort of very much in keeping with the nature. If you've been to Western Nebraska, which is where this is set, I mean, it could be Western Nebraska, it could be Eastern Colorado. You can cross back between the two of them and you won't know, because it's all pretty brown, pretty flat, pretty barren landscape. And it kind of fits with the style and the language that Cather was shooting for in this book. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you enjoyed reading the Sweet Dreams. And I understand